Ladies and gentlemen, today is the 6th of October 2021. The 6th of October actually is a very important date in the history of the State of Israel because two major things happened in this date in the past. The first is the Yom Kippur War, is the war which erupted in the 6th of October 1973. And the second one is what happened in Egypt in the 6th of October 1981, when the Egyptian president, Muhammad Anwar Sadat, was assassinated when he was celebrating his success and victory of the 6th of October 1973. In that ceremony, which was actually a military parade, he was assassinated in Cairo. I would like to briefly talk about these two events. The 1973 war is viewed as a very problematic war from the Israeli side, and many actually are talking about this war as a failure, that Israel was defeated by the Arab countries, of course, compared to the Six-Day War, which was in June 1967, where Israel came out as, with a big victory over 3.5 Arab armies, after Israel succeeded to destroy the Egyptian army and the Jordanian army and the Syrian army, and even hit the Iraqi army as well. The reality actually is all the way around. The Six-Day War started with a Moked operation in which Israel destroyed within 2 hours the air forces of these Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and also part of the air force of Iraq. And when you have the sky open, you can do whatever you like. You don't suffer any attack from the hostile air force because there was no any more Egyptian force, air force, or Jordanian or Syrian. Israel could do on the ground whatever Israel wanted, to run forward in Sinai, in the so-called West Bank, as it was those days, and onto the Golan Heights, because Israel controlled the air. Definitely a victory. The Yom Kippur War, 6 years later, in October 73, it started with a very, very problematic surprise when the Egyptian and the Syrian army actually invaded the Israeli side. And that day was very successful, both on the Suez Canal between Egypt and Israel, and on the Golan between Syria and Israel, when Syria succeeded to occupy the Hermon mountain and some other strongholds on the Golan. However, when we compare the wars, in a cold way, of course, the price of the Second War, Yom Kippur War, was tremendous. More than 3,000 Israelis were killed. But when we compare the outcome or the starting point and the end of the war, the Second War, the Yom Kippur War, was much more successful. Of course, the price was tremendous. But to compare the beginning of the war, when the Egyptians and the Syrians succeeded to invade the Israeli side, when the war ends, when Israel is in the areas which were not under Israeli control before the war, it is definitely a success, because Israel succeeded to cross the canal to the Egyptian side, to the African side of the Suez Canal, and to run to Cairo, and without the Soviet threat of those days, Israel would not stop. So definitely, Israel succeeded to push the Egyptian army back, to capture a whole army in Sinai, to isolate it from the Egyptian army, and to cross to the other side of the canal, and to stop only in the 101 kilometers before Cairo. So this is definitely a victory. In Syria as well, Israel not only succeeded to take back all the strongholds, including the Hermon mountain, and the other places in the Golan, Israel crossed the lines and went all the way to Damascus and stopped because of the Soviet threat. So the bottom line, or the end line of the war, was way much better than what was in the beginning. Therefore, the Yom Kippur War, in spite of the starting point, which was very problematic from the Israeli side, Israel succeeded to turn the table over and to turn this war from a defeat in the beginning to a victory on its end. So definitely we should remember this war as a war which actually saved Israel, because our enemies did not mean only to wipe out the occupation of 1967. Their plan was to wipe Israel altogether from the map. This is one thing which we should all remember about that war, and the price of that war was 3,000 Israeli casualties. The second thing of October the 6th is what happened in 1981, the assassination of Sadat. People keep saying that Sadat was assassinated because he made peace with Israel. Well, it is correct, but very partially. He was assassinated mainly because of his bad attitude, I would say, arrests, torture, hanging of the Islamist groups which flourished in Egypt in those days, especially after the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, which encouraged many groups to leave the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood was not radical enough, was not violent enough. And this is why we saw all kinds of little organizations, but very radical, like the Jama'a Islamiyya, the Islamic group, or the Jihad, the Egyptian Jihad, means the Jihad organization, or the Nagun min al-Nar, those who escape from hell, and another one very important organization, Takfir wal Higra, means to declare that the society is infidel and to migrate from the society. These are the four, I would say, most significant organizations which left Muslim Brotherhood in those years, and one of them, the Jama'a Islamiyya, actually is the one which succeeded to infiltrate into the army and to recruit some soldiers, and they actually were those who assassinated Sadat in that army parade in Cairo on the 6th of October, 1981. Some people say that, as I said, that he was assassinated because of the peace process. The peace process started in 1974-75, not because Sadat liked Israel. He hated Israel. He was actually the head of the Nazi group of Egypt in the 30s. As a young intellectual, he fell in love with the Nazi ideology when it was still legitimate, before the war, for the Second World War. And he was the leader of the Nazi group of Egypt. And he hated Jews because later Israel came to the world, and Israel was a story of success, while Egypt is a story of failure, and he knew it very well. And he envied Israel, and he hated Israel. However, during the 70s, he had a very big problem of some insect which destroyed the cotton fields of Egypt. And Egypt actually was based, the Egyptian economy was based on cotton, because this is what they shipped to the Soviets and get from the Soviets whatever they needed, weapons, ammunition, and many other things. And once this insect attacked the cornfield, the cotton fields of Egypt, he actually needed money. So he went to the Europeans and begged for a big donation, and they shaped a consortium of 40 banks in order to arrange this big support to Egypt. But the bankers said, well, we will give him money, and every couple of years he has a war with Israel, and what will be with everything which we give him? So they told him, look, you go and settle the issues with Israel, make peace with Israel, and we'll give you the money. We're not investing or giving money to war zones. There is no reason. So he came to Israel. Means he started the peace negotiations between Hassan Touhami, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Moshe Dayan in Morocco. It was in 1975. And later, in 1977, he came to Israel in the end of 77. And the Camp David agreements in 1978, under the auspice of Jimmy Carter, the American president. And then the signature of the peace agreement was in 1979, March, in the Blair House. And March 1982 was actually the implementation of the peace agreement, but he was not here anymore. It was Mubarak who succeeded him after he was assassinated. So he gave peace to Israel because of two reasons. One, because of his failure in 1973, which in spite of the success of the first day, he failed in the war and was defeated, actually, by accepting Israel on the other side of the Suez Canal in Egypt. And so he understood it. Israel is invincible. And therefore, as you know, the same logic has in the Middle East. If you cannot beat them, join them. So he joined us, and he gave us peace. Of course, it was cold peace, because he didn't want warm peace with Israel. But it was enough for the Europeans to give him the money. And so he can get all kinds of international recognition as somebody who can get prizes for making peace with Israel. And this is what pushed him. The fact that he was defeated. Because he said, look, we failed in 1948, we failed in 1956, we failed in 1967, and we didn't succeed also in 1973 in spite of the first day. So Israel is invincible. Let's give peace to Israel, because there is no other choice. And we needed the money. So this is why he made peace with Israel, not because he loved us, because he did not. And the conclusion is very clear. Israel can enjoy peace and live in the Middle East only because Israel is powerful, is invincible, and this is when our neighbors give us peace. Not because they love us, not because they want us here, not because they recognize the legitimacy of the mere existence of the state of Israel, even if Israel was on square centimeter on the seashore of Tel Aviv. They still think that Israel is illegitimate state. Even Mubarak, the one who kept the peace agreement with Israel, said that 1,000 years will pass, means never, 1,000 years will pass before I recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And this, what Mubarak said, the one who kept very strictly the peace agreement with Israel. Okay, so this is what I mean. There is a difference, or big difference, between peace with Israel as a fait accompli, which they cannot fight, and accepting Israel as something which has the legitimacy to be here. And while they accept Israel, because they cannot defeat Israel. They cannot and will not recognize the right of Israel to exist to begin with. And as we say in Hebrew, milechatchila. And this is what we have to take in account. It's not like Europe or America, which considers the existence of Israel, I hope, they consider the existence of Israel as something which should be. In the Arab world, they accept us only because they cannot defeat us, only because they cannot wipe us out from this place. And this we and the world should bear in mind constantly, that only strong Israel is Israel which can stay here in the Middle East as the bastion to protect the Western world. Because if our enemies succeed to defeat us, their next destination is beyond the sea, waiting for them. And everybody should bear it in mind. Strong Israel is the assurance for the Western world from the wrath of the Arab and the Islamic world. Please keep it in mind. Thank you so much.